and the schooner, with all sails set, was rushing with such speed that, in the words of one old salt, she must fetch up somewhere if it was only in hell. Then came another rush of sea fog, greater than any hitherto, a mass of dank mist, which seemed to close on all things like a gray pall, and left available to men only the organ of hearing, for the roar of the tempest and the crash of the thunder and the booming of the mighty billows came through the damp oblivion even louder than before.
So finding the fiction that delights you makes it easier to pick up the practice of reading fiction again. I know it's something that if I'm struggling to remember to make time for me to read that isn't for the children or isn't to teach, I want to grab something that's going to give me joy.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. In this episode, we will be interviewing novelist Eleanor Bourg Nicholson, author of A Bloody Habit, Brother Wolf, and she's also done some editing in classic literature such as Dracula. We spend a majority of the interview actually talking about Dracula as it relates to literature and its use within the horror genre of the Victorian age. We actually spend a little bit of time addressing Mrs. Nicholson's education background, which actually has to do with this Victorian period of time, specifically the Victorian anti-Catholicism. And I wanted to go ahead and just use this forethought opportunity to speak about how Victorian anti-Catholicism influenced this era's horror fiction. And specifically, we'll talk about Dracula. That's what we focus in the interview. And I thought I would just talk about that here. How this period was marked by this pervasive distrust and, honestly, an honest suspicion of Catholicism predominantly in what had become Protestant England. And that means that there are several threads, several aspects or sentiments of this anti-Catholicism woven into Brom Stokers' book. Specifically, Catholicism in Protestant England was often viewed as foreign and exotic, which was much like the character of Count Dracula. Dracula hails from Eastern Europe, a region perceived as mysterious or culturally distant from the Protestant West. There's also this use of the rhetoric of the time that often emphasized the superstition associated with Catholic practices, contrasting it with Protestant rationality. That means in Dracula, the use of the religious symbols like crucifixes, holy water, and the Eucharistic host reflects this tension. These symbols, rooted in Catholic tradition, are depicted as powerful tools against the supernatural evil of Dracula, despite this era's growing emphasis on science and reason. There's also this fear of moral corruption by foreign influence. Dracula's ability to seduce and corrupt his victims can be seen as a metaphor for the perceived moral dangers of Catholicism. The novel's emphasis on purity and the threat to virtuous characters, specifically women, reflects this era's concern about maintaining the moral and social order. This anti-Catholic sentiment often criticized the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church and its perceived threat to individual autonomy. And we see that with Dracula's control over his victims, and his ability to create a network of followers parallels these fears of authoritarian control and the loss of personal freedom. The last point I'm going to make is what is commonly called conversion anxiety. And this is the anxiety about religious conversion. And it's mirrored in the novel through the fear of vampiric transformation. Just as Protestant Victorians feared the influence of Catholic conversion, the novel's characters fear becoming vampires, losing their humanity, and again, autonomy in the process. Thus, Stoker's Dracula uses this Victorian anti-Catholicism to heighten the horror elements of the novel, reflecting contemporary anxieties about religion, foreignness, and moral integrity. And that means the interplay of these themes don't merely intensify the novel's Gothic atmosphere, but also provides insight into the cultural and religious tensions of the time. And so it is in the shadowy corners of human fear where faith and superstition intertwine. We find the roots of our deepest horrors. Dracula taps into the Victorian dread of the unknown, of foreign lands, foreign faiths, transforming religious anxieties into a timeless tale of terror. The Count may be a creature of fiction, but the fears he embodies are too real, lurking in the hearts of those who fear the loss of control, the seduction of the unfamiliar, and the corruption of the soul. The truth is out there, and sometimes it's buried deep within the shadows of our oldest fears. In the pursuit of truth, our fascination with vampires, werewolves, and zombies delves into the primal unknown. Are these creatures products of imagination? Or do they conceal an undiscovered truth? Vampires embody forbidden desires, werewolves the fear of losing control, and zombies, a symbol of societal collapse. We question whether these mythical beings reflect our deepest fears, or something more extraordinary. Joining us today is the author of several Gothic novels, a lay Dominican, mother, and Victorian literature instructor. She is the contemplative crafter, the resonant writer, the erudite eliciter of emotion. Eleanor Nicholson, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to bring you on the show because you write fiction, you write it well, and so I'm curious as to what themes or ideas inspire your writing, especially as it relates to the intersection of faith and literature.
Many themes. My background has involved a great deal of study of the classics, particularly the 19th century. At university, I was trained as a Victorianist. I actually specialized in anti-Catholicism of the British Victorian period. That was my graduate focus many moons ago. I was particularly interested in beautiful works of literature that had rich themes beyond what I see in many modern works of literature, which I feel are a little bit superficial. They don't have the depth, the sense of not just the existence of God, but how complex creation is. And so I was very attracted to the Gothic genre specifically, because I felt that it was a realm where you could talk about weighty themes such as life, death, salvation, damnation, and do it in a way that was compelling and not preachy. Because you can't really get away with those themes, say, in a domestic comedy, much as I enjoy domestic comedies, without coming off as proselytizing or cloying and annoying. And I saw a real potential for depth in Gothic, while at the same time I appreciated the outrageousness of that particular genre. It appealed to my sense of humor very much. So at the moment, that's primarily where my fiction work focuses. much as I would love to be able to write in other genres, but at the moment, Gothic's where I am.
Yeah, you've written many articles through several different Catholic media sources, the Catholic Register. Tell me about that process.
I have, those articles have permitted me to continue to indulge all of my scholarly interests. I also write on things such as homeschooling, which comes from my lived experience as a homeschooling mother, but always trying to integrate, as you said, those interests in literature, in faith, in what it means to be human and to have the deposit of faith passed on and to live that out in day-to-day life. So I find that it all is very interrelated. I like to say that raising children has given me a special insight into preternatural zombies and vampires and werewolves. But I also find it very illuminative that you can look at literature and it can express things about, as I said, what it means to be fully human. So that, I mean, even in something like Gothic fiction or Victorian fiction generally, or anti-Catholic fiction, or anything that I've written on, it becomes an expression of man's desire for God one way or another.
Fair enough. That's awesome. What are the most important themes that you find are necessary in writing fiction, especially if it's Gothic horror, basically?
A coherent moral anthropology. So understanding man's desire for happiness and the things that tend towards happiness and the things that don't. In that regard, I'm a Thomist Aristotelian, looking at the virtue-vice spectrum. When I teach, for example, Jane Austen to my students, I always say, here's the chart from Aristotle of the virtues and the vices. We can now map all of these characters onto the chart, and we can pretty much predict whether they will achieve happiness or not in this novel. And I find that plays out in creative work as well, that I like to think that the reasons the characters work is because they're rooted in an understanding of what man is and what gives him happiness and what doesn't. So I think that's a number one starting place. I'm very interested in the pursuit of happiness. I like happiness. I desire happiness. And I think that Aristotle and Aquinas are very right to say that man yearns for it. So everything that happens to us or to one of my characters becomes an interesting point of success in that quest or conflict.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. There's major importance in understanding how virtue vice play into the human anthropology. Absolutely. Well, when it comes to everyday discussion, I mean, this is pretty common. We like to share, hey, what's your favorite book? What'd you read? Since you're an author, how do you feel that literature contributes to discussions specifically about faith and culture, no matter how old the book is? Because I know you did an edit on Dracula, for example.
Yes, I spend a great deal of time in the Western literary canon, not just teaching high school homeschoolers, but teaching my own children. My husband and I were actually discussing this recently. His background is philosophy. He's a professor of philosophy, retired professor of philosophy. And we were talking about the integration of the humanities and saying that, properly speaking, the disciplines of the humanities are about that being fully human, and that it becomes a part of the way that we homeschool and the way that our household operates. And what I mean by that is that questions of faith and culture and literary expression, which all redound from who man is and his relationship with God, those are just interlaced into the fabric of our lives. It's ongoing discussions with our children, analysis of literature, which we do at every level. Our eldest is in 6th grade and our youngest is a toddler, but you find that those conversations occur very, very naturally. And we're not compartmentalized. It's not as if you say, well, this is the time just for our history lesson, so we don't talk about anything else. No, we ground it in our understanding of faith, our understanding of the emergence of culture, our understanding of what civilization is, and then the literary expression that flows from it. Our house is basically full of books and children, and it's a wonderful combination.
One of the major themes in specifically Dracula that has always been this interesting idea, this inner battle between colonialism and xenophobia, but basically this idea that seems to have been a product of Victorian England's ideas or attitudes toward foreign cultures and the mistrust associated with the unknown other.
I can see that definitely as a theme in my novels and in my studies of the period entirely, because, as I said, I specialized in anti-Catholicism of the Victorian period, became very, very interested in the way that post-English Reformation, being English became defined in opposition to those vicious papists. And the anxiety about it, yes, is very much expressed in Dracula, but in an interesting way, because it's not just the terrifying foreigner. You notice in Dracula, Count Dracula speaks almost without an accent, and that is petrifying, because it means he might be able to come in and we won't know he's here. On the other hand, the two most outlandish accents are Professor Van Helsing, who is sometimes impossible to understand, and Quincy Morris, who's so American, he's practically a stereotype. So there's a sense that that you can have within your circle of friends and effective vampire slaying team outsiders. But the scariest thing is if they are not easily recognizable as outsiders. And the anxiety about Catholicism specifically appears all over the novel. It's one of the things that first fascinated me about the novel, that vampires, of course, have a very strong Eucharistic theme, anti-Eucharistic theme. But to battle them, they have to import all that Catholic stuff. Van Helsing even sends for a consecrated host in Amsterdam. Of course, there were Catholic churches in England, in London. At that time, it was after Catholic emancipation, so they would have been able to access them. Maybe not for the sorts of bizarre sacrilege that Van Helsing perpetrates with the consecrated host. But there's a sense that it belongs outside. We English, that's something that's beyond us. Even early on, Jonathan Harker, Seeing a Rosary, says, this thing that I have been taught to mistrust, I'm a good Englishman, I don't touch that sort of thing, but now it's giving me comfort. And I think it's important to recognize that Stoker himself, in writing Dracula, was operating as a sort of an outside insider. He was a Protestant Irishman who relocated to London, so he wasn't English. But he also wasn't a papist, although his wife did convert to Catholicism. So he sort of dances around the anxiety about the incredible anti-Catholicism of many of the characters or many of his readers, but in a really interesting and dynamic way. I think it's one of the reasons it's one of the best of the Gothic novels.
And then one of the other notes that I have curious questions about within, well, I mean, specific, because you're an expert within the period with the Victorians. So something that really stands out to us moderns when we read something like Dracula is the appearance that female characters serve as these metaphors for both purity and then also for seduction. And so how does their struggle against Dracula specifically symbolize the society's expectations and constraints on women, specifically during the Victorian era versus today?
Well, it's another very interesting topic, because you have the desire to cherish, protect, and serve the pure ideal of the woman, the angel in the house. That's a Victorian concept based on a poem by Coventry Patmore. But there's also a great deal of anxiety regarding that, the innocence and the purity, saying that if Dracula is going to unsettle our entire civilization, one of the ways he's going to do it is by attacking our women. And I think that's actually a profound insight into how essential women are. But there are some other interesting dynamics in the particular book, because the primary female characters are Lucy Westenra, who is assaulted by Dracula and eventually becomes a seductive vampire whom they dispatch and restore to her purity in death in a sort of a bizarre way. Stoker didn't want her to be morally culpable for vampiric acts. He came up with this whole she was asleep when she became a vampire theory. Anyway, it's a little bit sloppy. But the one who's really of interest is Mina. Wilhelmina Harker is a powerhouse in that novel. And she teaches herself how shorthand. The fact that there's even a record, because Dracula is written as a series of journals, letters. There's a recording by one of the heroes. She collates them all and creates multiple copies of it, so that when Dracula finds it and he has a temper tantrum and he destroys their record, they have a backup copy because of Mina. She's also the one who, when the one of the characters is grieving, he's sort of repressing it, and then Mina consoles him, and he is able to find relief in his grief because Mina is there. Later on, there's some funny little details. Mina says things like, well, I just happen to have memorized all of the train's timetables, so I can plan out our next action. So she is an incredible point, uniting all the men, giving them tools to direct their work, but she also then becomes the primary victim, another primary victim of Dracula. And the men aren't able to protect her. And one of the reasons they're not able to protect her is they go back and forth about whether they're going to keep her in the know. So one minute they're saying it's really important that everybody knows everything. And then the next minute they say, but actually, Mina, we don't want to oppress you or soil your innocence, so we're not going to tell you what's going on. And the result is that then she becomes attacked by Dracula when simple precautions could have helped. So that's, I think, It is showing some of the conundrums of that particular period, but it's also showing many of the strengths. I think there was a much greater respect in some ways for women and their role in society then, but also Stoker was recognizing that Mina, for instance, she's not independently wealthy. She needs to have a skill set in case she has to support herself. And that skill set becomes useful for the team. And she also is able to fulfill herself as a wife and eventually as a mother, which becomes the pinnacle of the novel, that at the end, there is a child. That's in a Victorian novel. If you end with marriage and a child, that means the good guys win and everybody's happy. It means the civilization will continue on. So she becomes a point of hope, a point of inspiration. Some readers do struggle with the presentation of women in that novel, but also, as I said, I think it shows some of those weaknesses of the period, but has many strengths that could be helpful lessons for readers today.
Absolutely. That was a really good answer. I appreciate that. I had one more about Dracula just to ask. We're talking over hundreds feet, miles of internet cable, basically. And Dracula has these emerging technologies of their times, typewriters, phonographs, and the world in the novel is changing. That's all going on kind of in the periphery, but it's there. And so what kind of influence does these technologies have on their world as it moves into the future as we reflect on the novel Dracula?
I think another really important theme. So there are, as you noted, many inventions and technological innovation. There's a Kodak camera in there. There are flashlights in that book. Really, really neat. And these become tools that they're able to use. But they're also a mark of the extreme skepticism of the period. This is why Van Helsing points out that London in the late 1800s is the place of most promise for Dracula, because everyone there is focused on progress and advancement and development and technology. They don't believe in vampires. So if Dracula can go someplace where nobody believes in him, it's much safer for him, right? So that is one aspect, that they become important tools in fighting Dracula, but they also have limitations because they need things more ancient. They think they can use their flashlights, but they also need garlic because it repels vampires. So having folklore and technology together really adds to the spice of the novel, but it also speaks to the anxiety of that end of the Victorian period, which in my own writing fascinated me as well. As you're coming to the end of the 1800s, what's going to happen is when we become 1900, will the world end? I tell my students about anxiety before Y2K. They don't believe me because none of them were born before the year 2000. Say, no, really, there was anxiety. I know people who are prepping. And just saying that the sense of what if all this technology fails? What if it goes away? And we no longer have the equipment, the tools for a preternatural threat that defies technology. But again, it was something Stoker was very interested in. One fun note, in his notes, he indicated that he considered having a photograph taken of Dracula. And his theory was not only would vampires be invisible in a mirror, but if you took a photograph, all you would see was the skeleton. Not sure precisely how that would work, but it's just really neat to think of Stoker's playing with that.
Have you read any of the books? Like Montague Summers wrote a book about werewolves. Have you read any of those when you were doing research for your own stuff?
Oh yes! Oh my goodness! Yes, I've read many of those, and the Sabine Baring Gould, I think, Book of Werewolves, and yeah, so a lot of that pseudo folklore recording, but. It is interesting. The waves of anti-vampire and anti-werewolf hysteria came on the heels of the Enlightenment. And that speaks again to that notion of London as the place of most promise for Dracula, because the Enlightenment would not only have put the nail in the coffin on metaphysics and all those papist practices, but dismissed things like monsters, but then they had extreme anxiety about, well, what if there are, and what about these weird things that happen here, there, everywhere? What about the occult? So they would do these scientific studies, pseudoscientific studies, and collect stories. Another funny point, in a papal document, I think it's Benedict the 14th, but he wrote a chapter speaking about the proper treatment of the bodies of saints. And he has a chapter dedicated to the proper treatment of bodies believed to be vampiric, in which he was telling the faithful to stop digging up bodies and desecrating them because of fear that they were vampires. There's a similar document in the Eastern tradition as well.
So it wasn't merely, hey, stop digging these bodies up because that's how science kind of progressed with anatomy, etc., was by the disinterment of the dead. Kind of an interesting twist.
I could see that being a major contributor as well. And that's another interesting, it's like the side of scientific advancement and terror of the preternatural and folklore and superstition. So superstition and science are neck and neck often. And it speaks to people's anxieties about, well, what happens to dead bodies? Well, what if there are souls connected to dead bodies? Well, what if there is life after death? What does it look like? Well, what if there's a dead body and it comes back and it's chewing on me in the night? Those sorts of terrors, which I think are ingrained in man. Aquinas has a wonderful line where he says it would, I think it caused a man discomfort if he thought something untoward were to happen to his body after death. And I think I think he's quite right. I feel that.
Not merely just thinking about life, death, heaven, hell, and purgatory. Life, death, heaven, hell, and being eaten by worms, right? I mean, when you take your education and then you apply it, because you've applied your Victorian education, clearly, as we spoke about Dracula, and you've written a vampire novel of your own, A Bloody Habit, in which we have a priest who is a vampire hunter. What elements did you take, or inspiration did you take from anywhere, other authors who wrote about vampires besides Bram Stoker, to employing it in your own creation? I
was very inspired by Dracula specifically, but the entire vampire tradition, especially as it has developed and I would say devolved in the last 120 something years since Dracula.
Devolved because you speak of Twilight.
Yes, I'm very nauseated by Twilight, but
sorry,
it's so bad. But there has been this descent into seeing the vampire as the transgressive outsider who we are just too judgmental to accept, and it's also the romantic notion that a vicious man, the bad boy, will be converted and redeemed by love, which I think is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It's actually dangerous nonsense. The sort of thing that I wouldn't want my daughters to think, because nope.
That's Lost Boys.
Yeah, exactly. And just looking at, my love will save him. Nope, sure won't. That's not a healthy thing to be taking into a relationship. But I noted various things in the tradition. One was that I felt the most effective at vanquishing a preternatural threat would be somebody like a matter-of-fact Dominican friar, a priest, who confects the Eucharist every day. And he isn't going to be fazed by the theatrics of the preternatural. It's not really going to impress him. It's not going to freak him out. He's going to be, it's just a job. It's what you do, and handle it with humor and serenity. On the other hand, I knew that effective though such a character would be in dispatching vampires, that particular character would be lousy as the narrator of a Gothic novel. You need a narrator who's freaking out. You need a narrator who has terror and suspense and anxiety. So that's how I was able to develop in that novel and in subsequent novels the sense of what sort of narrator I would need to be the one telling the story. Otherwise, it would become a little bit pedantic, a little bit academic, a little bit boring. I wanted my readers to be able to have the emotional ride of the narrator while handling the preternatural with what I thought was the most effective character for that sort of business. So that was very much at play. But I also had a very specific inspiration point for Bloody Habit. I thought it through this for a while, written on Dracula, and I was staying at a Dominican convent on a writing retreat. And I saw a Dominican friar who was a friend of mine. He was there to teach the nuns. And he's now the Rector Magnificus at the Angelicum. So an incredibly brilliant theologian. And he and I were having dinner together. And he said, when you are on a retreat, there's one thing you have to do. And I tried to sit up straight and look intelligent and said, well, what's that, Father? And he said, take a nap. I felt a little deflated, but the next day I stopped in the middle of my writing and thought, well, I'm obedient. I'll take a nap. I don't like naps, but I'll do it. And I lay down on the bed in this little convent, looked at the wall, and the only decoration was an image of Veronica's veil. And it looks like a disembodied floating head on a gold background. And I started laughing and thought, well, if Catholics are better at dispatching vampires, it's because we're weirder than vampires. And then I fell asleep. I had a nightmare and I woke up and wrote the first chapter.
So you fell asleep, had a nightmare, and then wrote the first chapter. That sounds quite the inspirational story.
It was. It is also very good with the history of Gothic, because most really good Gothic novels, at some point or other, the novelist claims to have had a dream for inspiration. So when that happened, I felt it was gold. It was gold. I knew that we were. It took 7 years to write A Bloody Habit, but I knew that the start could come to something because it had originated in a nightmare.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said about the artist and dreams. Well, you'd also written a really awesome werewolf novel that there's so much underlying humor within the book, because we have these Franciscans, and we know that St. Francis really loved animals. And so, but you have this guy and he's a werewolf, and it's like, well, they probably shouldn't be in the cloister, but here he is, Brother Wolf. Could you talk for a little bit about going from vampire to werewolves?
Well, it actually seemed a natural thing. When I was, after A Bloody Habit came out, I frequently said, oh, well, werewolves are next. And it made sense that having written about Dominicans and vampires, and of course my Dominicans come back, but then the werewolves, they'd have to be Brother Wolf, ha, 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 because of St. Francis. Franciscans and Brother Wolf, absolutely. And then another important point for me was in discussing with my husband my theories of vampirism. And I held forth and I said, no, the vampire victim before death is like an addict. And this is why. And my husband listened very patiently. And about 2 days later, he came back to me and said, actually, no, werewolves are more like addicts. And this is why. And I said, oh my goodness, that's brilliant. And then you can work in themes like the Franciscan tradition has had an emphasis on harnessing the will to God. Well, say you're a convalescent werewolf and you're being ministered to within a Franciscan community. Well, it would be harnessing your will as a werewolf-inclined addict. What does that discipline look like? And what happens if you relapse? And that became the framework for part of the framework for that novel. But I'm also very glad that you picked up on the humor, because I must confess, one of my awkward coping mechanisms is humor. I laugh a lot, not just at myself, but at everything, the foibles of this fallen world. Yes, when I'm nervous, I always laugh very much. So that's one of the things, as I said earlier, that appeals to me in the Gothic is that it's outrageous enough that there can be moments of unintentional hilarity that are terrifying. When the first time I read Dracula, I was a college student. I was laying on my bed at home, reading it, laughing at it. Oh, this is so absurd. And then I looked down and realized that the cover of the book was blood red and the sunlight was coming in the door or in the window and it was reflecting off the cover and my hands looked like they were bathed in blood. So I went from laughing to absolute terror and I had to put the book down.
Wow.
But I like that. I like that those come together. That's how I handle many things in life. And I think that characters who have a sense of humor are more likely to survive one of my books.
One thing that I enjoyed a whole lot when I read your long list of accomplishments, I didn't know you wrote a children's novel. I don't have any of my own yet, so I don't seem to shop in the children's section at the local Catholic bookstore, but you had written a book about Saint Dominic, and you tell the story through the dog, the hound of heaven, basically. His name is Torch. Besides saying, hey mom, write a book for me that we can understand, what other goals did you have in mind in writing a children's story?
Well, I love the Dominicans very much, and I've been associated with them for decades. And I found, when I wrote that particular book, I was the director of religious education at our parish, and I found that many people, young and old, though they loved St. Thomas Aquinas, and they might even know about Albert the Great, they didn't really know about St. Dominic. And I love St. Dominic very deeply and just find him an inspiring saint, just emanating joy, and the way that he championed truth so perfectly balanced with charity. There's a story that there was an innkeeper who'd been seduced by the Albigensian heresy, and Dominic stayed up all night, not browbeating him, but speaking with him, building that relationship with him from which the innkeeper returned to the faith. So that joy that he exuded, but also that perfect charity, just really has resonated with me. It's not something that it's something I aspire to, but I'm a long way off. But I found too, there's an old legend that St. Dominic's mother, when she was pregnant with him, had a dream about a dog with a torch in its mouth, and the dog set the world on fire. And that's taken by medievalists, especially via a Latin pun, Dominicanes, hounds of the Lord, the Dominicans, to represent St. Dominic, that he was the dog with a torch in its mouth. Well, that just seemed to me, again, like the title of Brother Wolf, like Dominicans slaying vampires, made absolute sense as a vehicle for introducing children to St. Dominic. And it did very much, as you know, to give me joy that my children then were allowed to read something I'd written. the writing about Saint Dominic, it was itself a source of joy and delight. And the voice of Torch was fun to write. And I, as a novelist, when you find a voice that's fun to write, writing becomes so delightful. A side note on Brother Wolf, I originally had a different narrator. It was, for those who've read it, the character of Isabel, who is the sister of the relapsed Franciscan werewolf. And anyway, she has all sorts of preternatural torments of her own and emotional repression. Oh, she was awful to write as narrator. I hated it. I only got through about 3 chapters and thought, there's something wrong here. I can't write in this voice. She's not funny. But I found a different voice, and that voice delighted me to write. And then that becomes a fulfilling and entertaining endeavor as a writer versus trying to make a voice work that just isn't working. Torch was also delightful. He was an easy voice to write.
A playful voice, because dogs are the ultimate goofballs, in my opinion. I've got 2 corgis that would totally agree with that.
Yes, he many years ago, I had a pug corgi Jack Russell Terrier mix who was named after a Dominican saint, Saint Hyacinth, and he was black and white, absolutely mischievous. And often when I was writing Torch, I could see Hyacinth's face.
And a lot of writers face these challenges. You spoke about, trying to find the right voice. And that's something that many writers do experience, is trying to figure out what exactly do they want to say and how they want to say it, but where do they want that voice to come from? And that's one of your challenges, clearly. But how do you overcome other challenges that you might have faced in your writing journey?
I would say that a great deal of it is actually discipline. So I have been writing ever since I learned how to form words, just in the same way that I've always had a relationship with literature, because my mother was a voracious reader and literature was just part of our life. And those sort of cultural, historical conversations, I grew up with that. So it's second nature. Writing too, the discipline of writing, of being able to be a rigorous editor, that's something that's been acquired through not just academic studies, but for many years, I supported myself as a freelance writer and editor. So I was usually writing and editing other people's work and ghostwriting. And I did everything from a respiratory care dictionary to rewriting parts of STEM dissertations at our local university, because they had the technical know-how, but not the mastery of the English language. So a lot of that experience actually was very maturing for me as a writer and made me less fearful or possessive or protective. So I tell my students and my children and any burgeoning young writers, I throw out a lot of what I write. And I rewrite it, and I rewrite it, and I rewrite it. So I tell them, don't be discouraged. If you can only write a sentence here and a sentence there, you've just written a couple of sentences. And understanding the process, understanding that a great deal of it's going to be thrown out the window, understanding that much as I love writing, it has to be on the value system. It has to go after care of my children and homeschooling and various other obligations that I have, domestic, but also professional, balancing all of that and yet making time for writing. It just, again, goes back to discipline, goes back to balance, I think. In some ways, it's the discipline of regular exercise, healthy diet, a robust prayer life. When they're all in place, I know that writing flourishes along with everything else. When some things need some tweaking, writing might be a little bit rougher. So as I mature as a writer and as a human being, I am better at recognizing what's needed in every aspect of life. So basically, I'd say writing integrated in a holistic, healthy, spiritual, physical, mental, emotional life is where it's at. And just knowing that the process of writing is what gives me joy. So not being too wedded to outcomes, because anyone who wants to be a writer knows, much as we'd all love to be millionaires from our writing, it's not very likely to happen. being at peace with that, because it's really about telling the story and engaging with readers. You said very kind things about my books, and that is the greatest gift. That is a blessing. That's better than a royalty check.
I would like to ask if you've got, you have a lot of stuff you've edited. You've made critical essays and written a lot of things. What's your next big edit book that's supposed to be, or is in the pipeline if you're allowed to talk about it?
The next big thing I have a bunch of smaller projects that'll be coming out over the course of this year, but my third Gothic novel will be out in the fall of 2024, and its title is Wake of Malice, and I'm dealing with demonic zombie leprechauns and occult practices in a rustic Western Irish parish. Also, I think absolutely hilarious. Some of the themes might be, well, I don't know if they're heavier than previous ones. There's a great deal about death. But I'm wondering if it's the funniest of my three Gothic novels. So that'll be coming in the fall. I'm very excited about it. It's been a lot of fun to write. Very funny, I think. I find it funny. It makes me laugh a lot.
Well, the idea of demonic leprechaun zombies is actually quite funny to me, too. Really.
It's been, I've been working with a couple of Irish beta readers, and I've worked a great deal of Irish folklore into it, and the tumultuous history of that folklore, especially with regards to the faith and so-called pious practices that become not just eccentric, but outright abuses and lead to the occult. Anyways, which is very tied into the history of the particular period. But I did have to laugh when one of my readers said, "Oh, you Americans, you always start with the leprechauns, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, the leprechauns, that's the candy. That's going to be attract the readers, because we want to see the leprechauns. And then I can develop everything else in this rich folklore. But yes, we're looking for the leprechauns."
Is there anything else, besides, do you have any more critical essays? The one that you wrote about Jane Eyre, and
I've messed with the Brontes a few times. I've written an article on Catholicism in Jane Eyre, especially with regard to Rochester. I've written on Wuthering Heights generally. I do have an article coming out this spring on illustration as a pedagogical tool in studying Jane Eyre, where the protagonist is herself a visual artist. So I use that to unpack themes with my students, and then they're often inspired to create literary work. So I'm doing that. Usually my writing reflects what I'm teaching or about to teach. So a whole lot of Dickens coming down the pipeline, because I love Charles Dickens. Critical work on a little-known English Catholic novelist named Josephine Ward, who is making a teeny bit of a comeback and really should be read more widely. Yeah, those are the sorts of things that are on my desk. Also hoping to write a second after the St. Dominic children's book, trying to do a second in a sort of a torch series as children and life permit.
My wife's favorite, it took a long time trying to get her to give me a classic literature book she likes. Her favorite is Little Women. Do you have anything that you could speak on that for a minute?
It's a funny thing. My eldest daughter adores Louisa May Alcott. I read everything she wrote when I was about that age. And I struggle in rereading it because of, and this is an American thing. I find this often with American writers, whereas I can read a British Protestant novelist of the same period, I can appreciate and enjoy it more easily, whereas the American writers do tend to have a stronger puritanical influence. And so even though there are parts of Little Women that I think are absolutely beautiful and I've enjoyed with my two eldest girls, and sometimes I just want to say, stop preaching at me, because that's the vibe I get from Alcott. But I get that frequently from the American tradition, which I'm very well read in it, but I don't read it for joy. Which I think is an important distinction. I always try to admit it to my students, saying, "Oh no, absolutely, we can discuss this thoroughly. I don't read that for joy, but you may." So I admire. I know many people who love Little Women, and I value it, but I wouldn't pick it up for fun, except to read it with my daughters. On the other hand, we are rereading, or I'm rereading, and they are reading various Jane Austen novels with me for the first time. And it's tremendous fun. It's so much fun. My second eldest, who is very much like Marianne Dashwood, hates Marianne Dashwood. And I think this is illuminative and probably character building for my 10-year-old. Because this is so annoying. She's so dramatic. She's just, nobody can teach her. She's just, I said, yes, she lacks the virtue of docility. Let's look at that. It's an interesting choice. But there are many British novels I would recommend to her as a counterpoint, as a sort of a coming of age novel for a young woman. The one that I was talking with a male student, which really surprised me, I Capture the Castle. That's a phenomenal book. That's a beautiful book. So I Capture the Castle is the one that first comes to mind. I was very impressed that he'd read it, and he wanted to talk about some of the literary critical insights in it. That's a beautiful one. And that's the one that first leaps to mind if we're not going to go straight to Jane Austen, which I usually do. But yeah, no, try I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. It's a lovely book. It's charming. It doesn't have the interrelationship of sisters. For that, I think the best interrelationships of sisters would come from Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen understood sister relationships. By the way, I have no sisters. I have 5 brothers. So I always found it fascinating and intriguing, that world where you grew up with a girl next to you.
Well, as we wind down, can you tell the listeners where they can find more about you, where they could find or purchase your books, etc.?
The best place to start is I have a personal website. It's my full name. I publish with my middle name just because there was an Eleanor Nicholson who wrote travel narratives, and I am not that Eleanor Nicholson. So Eleanor Bourg, Bourg, Nicholson.com. And that can plug you into, I have a Facebook page, an Instagram account. I do a newsletter when I remember that it's there. And that can direct you. Any major bookseller has links to my books. Of course, if you can bring yourself to order directly from me or from the publisher, it's better for the publisher and for me than, say, someplace like Amazon. But you can find me on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and things like that. So please, if you do look me up and you want to reach out, I love, love, love hearing from readers.
Yeah, definitely, because it was going to the local Benedictine seminary, which is where I found A Bloody Habit. And that's where I was first introduced to your stuff, because it was sitting on a bookshelf in their coffee shop bookstore. And I said, well, I don't like reading fiction. Let me read this one, and tried to get myself to read fiction again. And it was a pretty good book. I enjoyed A Bloody Habit. I also enjoyed reading Brother Wolf a little bit too. It's always awesome to try to get back into reading fiction. Many people seem to walk away from it.
Well, it does happen. I know as a teacher and a mother, and I find myself saying, wait, I need to make sure I'm reading too. And for me, it's usually pulling out something that is going to delight me. I've read a great deal of significant work through my life. And at this period of my life, with small children and teaching and all the other stuff, my go-to were things like Gothic fiction, murder mysteries. There's something really relaxing in a murder mystery. So finding the fiction that delights you makes it easier to pick up the practice of reading fiction again. I know it's something that if I'm struggling to remember to make time for me to read that isn't for the children or isn't to teach, I want to grab something that's going to give me joy.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Have a lovely day.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.